Good morning,
Okay.
everybody, once again. My name is Brett from Room to Grow, and this is our Wednesday talk, now held monthly in association with Stanby and Straight Nature. And it is a pleasure and a privilege today to introduce Paul Barker, and especially on a topic that is very current and relevant at the moment and needing a lot of attention. So the more knowledge we can gain and the more information can be spread, the better. So Paul joins us today to discuss the role of the citizen science in monitoring the spread of the pot shot hole borer. Paul is the gardener for the Friends of the Ardoon Gardens, and he says it's a great privilege to be involved in the management of a world-class arboretum with 6 champion trees and many more worthy of champion status. Paul says the Ardoon is one of the finest public gardens in Southern Africa. As part of his responsibilities and looking after the Ardoon, Paul developed a keen interest in understanding of the invasive shot hole borer beetle, which is closely following the response of the PSHB in California, Israel, South Africa, and now recently in Perth. He was involved with the identification and confirmation of the beetle in the Somerset West in April 2019 and in Newlands in January 2023. And a great resource is the PSHB update page on Facebook, of which Paul is the administrator. As normal, as the talk goes on, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the end of the talk. So thank you very much, Paul. Over to you.
Brett, thanks. Folks, good morning. I'm just going to start off with a short video that's produced by the people at FABI to kind of set the tone.
The Polyphagous Shot Hole Borer is a tiny invasive beetle from Asia that has recently been discovered in South Africa. Although only 2 millimeters in length, this tiny beetle has detrimental consequences for South African trees as it carries a destructive fungus. The female beetle creates tunnels in the trunks and branches of host trees and lays their eggs inside, causing the fungus to spread. The fungus is a food source for the beetles and their larvae, but in susceptible trees, it kills the vascular tissue, disrupting the flow of water and nutrients to the tree, causing branch dieback and ultimately the death of the tree. How can we help? There is no way to eradicate the invasion in South Africa. However, some treatments and management strategies can reduce its impact and further spread. As an affected tree grower or homeowner, you can help curb the spread of the beetle in the following ways. Determine whether the symptoms are really caused by PSHB. If you are unsure, ask for help from municipal help desks or your local arborist. If the tree is a heavily infested reproductive host, cut it down. If the main stem is not infested, you can remove the infested branches. Dump the wood at dedicated municipal dumping sites. Do not move firewood around, especially not out of the infested area where you live. Or you can leave the chopped wood in full sun under thoroughly sealed clear plastic sheets for at least 1 month in summer or several months during winter. Municipalities can take additional action, such as cut down heavily infested reproductive host trees from streets and public areas. Create dedicated dumping sites where infested wood can be dumped. Chip wood, where possible, to pieces finer than 2 centimeters at the dumping sites. Provide an online help desk where the public can report infested trees and get information. Please note that there is currently no safe and legal chemical product registered to use on PSHB in South Africa. If you need assistance, please contact any one of the available services.
So, folks, morning. Well, welcome. I'd like to introduce you to the bark beetles. These are one of the most rapidly diversifying and most widely distributed and probably the most ecologically and economically significant group of ambrosia beetles. Within this is the Xylobori. And with my cursor, I'm going to point out this little character right here at the top. That's Uwalacea ornicatus. And it's got a close relative over here called Xyloberinus. But it's generally quite a large group of beetles. And unlike other ambrosias, this type of bark beetle doesn't work within the cambium of the tree. It actually bores into the xylem, hence the name Xyloborini. So let's have a look at a little pest pathogen complex. Urulaceae fornicatus. There are at least another 4 species within this group, and there are a couple of variations within the fornicatus species itself. But within the genus, there's one which is called Injectoratus, which is a tea shot hole borer, which is relatively, how should we say, not as economically or ecologically dangerous as the Polyphagous shot hole borer, which means that it goes unidentified for a long time. But through the work of the International Plant Sentinel Network, greatly sponsored by Botanical Garden Conservation International and the Forestry Agrobiotechnology Institute in Pretoria, which was co-funded by the South African National Biodiversity Institute, they started to look at botanical gardens and establish arboretum around the country. And this is how we managed to figure out we had a problem. And this beetle, which is, well, extremely small, less than 2 mils in length and less than 1 mil in width, carries a pathogenic fungi called Fusarium, and this one is particularly related to Urulaceae fornicatus, and it's called Fusarium urulaceae. So how the beetle kind of goes about its reality is a mated or unmated female, and remember, the female doesn't actually have to be mated to lay eggs, finds a suitable host in which it bores into the xylem, and the fungus that it carries with us, the Fusarium, it establishes in these tunnels or galleries, which is the food source for itself, and later, as it lays its eggs within inside the gallery, the food source for its larvae. Now, the female does not have to be mated, as I said, to lay eggs. All eggs that she lays, if she's unmated, come out as male. And within about 30 days, she's able to then mate with her offspring and then produce female larvae. And if we have a look at the larvae, they feed exclusively on this fungus. The little black one over here is a female, and the little brown one over here is a male. Now, the males actually don't fly, but they do leave the gallery to go search for other galleries on the same tree, but the larva goes through different stages. So these siblings, they mate with each other within the galleries deep inside the tree, and the females then leave these galleries and attack the same tree, hence the name shot hole borer, because it almost looks like the tree has been shot with shotgun shot. All right, and then the cycle carries on and on and on. So if we have a look at the chronology over here, is the beetle was first detected in a backyard in Los Angeles on an avocado tree in 2003. And very shortly thereafter, the pest alert was put out and was discovered in many other places. California has been quite successful in managing this because they've got quite a few geographic borders. So the beetle hasn't actually really been able to spread as far as it was initially predicted. But in Israel, which is a lot smaller country, they've had the beetle in their avocado orchards since 2009, and they've been able to relatively well manage it, but they've also been extremely effective at it. Now, we picked it up in 2017, Dr. Trudy Pop, together with the International Plant Sentinel Network, doing a survey of then KwaZulu-Natal National Botanical Gardens in Pietermaritzburg, founded on pine trees. And very soon thereafter, it was discovered in Johannesburg and then in George. And then unfortunately, in 2021, the beetle was discovered a bit after the fact, unfortunately, in Perth in Western Australia. And they've currently been managing it now for 2 years. So kind of one of the things you're going to see, and this is what really is concerning about this beetle, is if you have a look on the left-hand side over here, you've got the Fusarium spreading in red, and this is on box elder. This is Acer negundo, and you can see these little galleries, and this is where the beetle is mating. And we did a cross-section and a cut of this little piece of wood, and you can actually see hundreds of galleries and little larvae popping their little heads out. And what's quite evident, and this is another tree, this is a very old Quercus robur, French oak, pedunculate, in Somerset West, and you can actually start to see the dieback in this section. And that's pretty much an indication that there's a problem on the way. And if you have a look at this, this is why we've got such a problem, and it's deep within inside the wood. I mean, this is all within the sapwood over here. There's very little action happening within the bark and the cambium. It's pretty much happening here. So why is this so concerning? Is we actually have a look at the reproductive host species. These are where the beetle is able to breed. We've got quite a few invasives. We've got the longleaf wattle, the black wattle, and the blackwood. And then the acer family. Almost all of the acers that we grow in South Africa, unfortunately, are susceptible and able to host reproductive of this. So of concern is pecanut, casuarina, which is used extensively in woodbreaks, and a lot of our street trees, including our beautiful magnolias. And then we get to the apples, which is a bit of a concern for the fruit industry, and avocado. So quite a few of our commercial and street trees and ornamentals are susceptible over here. And the ones that are extremely susceptible are things like Gason Lagunda, the English oak, the weeping willow, and the erythrinas. But also of great concern, unfortunately, is the fact that this beetle has escaped into the natural ecosystem. So our natural ecosystems are a lot more robust than urban trees, which are under continuous stress from pollution, temperature, impact from construction, and many other environmental factors. But within the forests, one would think that trees are a little bit more robust, but the beetle has been quite focused on the pioneer species. We can have a look at the combretums, the brachelinas over here, erythrinas, the indigophoras, celeria, which is not quite, it's a bit of a concern because some of these celeria species over here are actually critically endangered. And then are also attacking natural willow and some of the street trees like Trachylea and Vepris and Virgilia. So what is a reproductive host species? These are trees that are susceptible to the beetle and its fungus, which allow them to establish their galleries and reproduce. There are over 100 of them and counting. Of major concern, primary is the acer family, maples. And then we get our oaks, our planes, our coral trees, avocado, willow, wattles, which we heavily reliant upon for firewood, and then castor oil, which nobody really cares about. So non-reproductive host species, these are ones that are attacked by the beetle, but they're unable to complete their life cycle. And these hosts aren't expected to die. Some stress trees do get negatively affected, but in general, they don't. And these unfortunately include citrus and grapes, which we really unknown what their long-term effect is going to be from the fungus. But luckily enough, and a lot of people are going to be unhappy about this, is that the eucalypts are generally unaffected. And it was actually really important when identifying this. A lot of eucalypts tend to leach a sap called kino, and people can kind of misdiagnose this. So what have we learned about managing PSHB? The tree on the right-hand side here is a plane tree that somebody has applied a mixture to improve the well-being of the tree. It doesn't seem to have actually functioned over here. This looks like a kaolin-based mixture, but these trees are heavily stressed on the road, and the beetle just continues to attack them, and we can actually start to see some delamination. So what can we do? The first thing we need to have a look at is we need to have a look at monitoring trees. If we don't know where the beetle is, we can't manage it. Unfortunately, we need to look at removing amplifier trees. Amplifier trees are trees that have infested to a point where they are emitting beetles. The beetles are leaving this tree and going in search of other hosts. We need to dispose of the material safely. We need to practice biosecurity and sanitation after we've done so. We need to be very careful of our green waste as a pathway for pests, not only for PSHB or Laccifornicatus, but many other pathogens and pests. Moving firewood is probably or wood in general, is the quickest way we can facilitate the movement of this beetle. It doesn't move that fast. It can only really fly 400 meters at most. And moving firewood, we can move at thousands of kilometers in days. And don't fall for the charlatans. There's always people willing to take your money. And then what can we do to help? Without further ado, let's have a look at the monitoring. So to monitor means we can find infested trees early. This is a oak, or actually, no, this is an Acer Nagunda on the right-hand side. And you can actually see the little entry-exit hole over here and a little bit of snot coming out of that, and then you get this leaching. And this is what is the tree's natural defense to try to push the beetle out. And in combination with the fungus, this actually emits substances which attract the beetle to these trees. So wherever possible, visual tree surveys are preferred over monitoring traps. Monitoring traps are a passive detection method, which is useful for large areas, for example, on estates in the Helderberg, in Franschhoek, in Kruger National Park, around the fruit-growing areas, and Kirstenbosch, for example. However, regular inspections of individual trees are recommended for the homeowner and within managed landscapes like estates or parks. And though the passive trapping system can pick the beetles up 6 months before the symptoms are evident, the beetle is going to spread everywhere. So being able to monitor what you've got and looking for these symptoms is the best way to actually get a head start on this. And if time allowing, visual monitoring is the most accurate and precise way to detect PSHB. So if we kind of have a look at the symptoms of this on the left-hand side, we've got a castor oil that the beetle loves. And this just drills holes in it. We don't see too much additional symptoms from that. But with the oaks, we start to see a bit of a powdery frass when it gets evolved. With the wild plum, the hyperphyllums, we get these little noodles. Also with the coral trees, we get this little noodling. And then with kapok, we got the beautiful staining. Early attack over here on acacia. We get this resinous little droplets, and the pecans on the left-hand side over here is once the beetle's quite established, we get these wet stainings and spots. And then as it gets older, you start to see delamination as the Fusarium starts to affect the vascular system, and you start to see the delamination of the bark over here. Then avocado, this is very important for the homeowners over here, as you get these sugary volcanoes, almost perfectly white, growing on the branches and on the stem. And then the London plains, which are very easy to spot in driving by once they're being infested, is you can start to see these stainings and exudate coming from the entry-exit holes. And as this progresses, the holes tend to dry up as the tree attempts to compartmentalize, and eventually it develops these callus over it. So the London plains are the ones that probably take the longest to die, and in the process can emit millions of beetles. So how do we go about looking for these symptoms? They say the pen is mightier than the sword. Definitely in this effect over here, a pen is very useful, because the beetle's entry-exit holes are roughly the same size as a medium-sized ballpoint pen nib, and it's very important in identifying and having a look at a picture for this, because one, it gives you scale, and two, it shows you exactly where that entry-exit hole is. Once you find that, and you can actually see the little beetle's bum sitting out over here as the female protects it. She's backing out, she's protecting her brood over there. And when you scrape away at that, what you start to see is you start to see the staining in and around the exit hole. And that's a pretty good indication that if that hole is the same size as a medium ballpoint pen nib, that it is PSHB in a tree. So let's just kind of go over those symptoms again. So we've got this staining. So there's our entry-exit hole. We've got the staining that we find on many tree species. And then we've got the frass and sawdust. And then we've got the sugary exudate. And then we've also got the gumming. So those are the four main symptoms that we're looking for when you're observing. So yeah, the symptoms are the way we look for this beetle, as the size of it is so small that it often goes unnoticed. I mean, you can have a look in this scale over here. It's extremely small on a piece of wood, and that's why we look at the symptoms. So this beetle's galleries are created inside the trees, sapwood in the way to the heartwood of this branch over here. And this is where they farm their fungi as their food source. And you can see just how adventurous this beetle becomes as it looks for a source of fresh food, and as it expands its galleries to breed. So those beetle entry-exit holes. So the beetle doesn't enter one hole and exit another hole. It uses the same hole the whole time. So it's very easy to kind of like just figure out whether or not those holes are active. And you can actually do that by painting a bit of paint over. And if you come back in a day or two's time, if that hole is open, then that gallery is still active. If the hole is closed and the gallery is no longer active. So the discoloration and staining, we see this quite a bit on trees as they get advanced. It's the reaction of the tree's immune system trying to manage this beetle, and the reaction with the fungus that causes almost reddish to creamish staining around the entry-exit holes. And then we start to get this resinous activity. You can actually see on some of these trees over here, the tree is actually able to push the beetles out with its resin. But unfortunately, in Perth, these beetles seem to have developed a little bit of a taste for ficus. And we start to see these examples. Though we've been seeing this type of symptoms on ficus for many years, this is alarming and concerning. And then, yeah, typical image of the sugar volcanoes that you're going to find on your avocados. And then we get the frass and noodling. And once you start to see this, you've really got an issue. These are little what we call frass noodles. And this tree over here is an indication of a highly infested tree and more than likely going to die within months. And when that tree dies and is no longer able to support that beetle, it emits millions of beetles to neighboring trees. Another one of the symptoms we look for, and this is the easiest way to kind of spot it scanning, though we do have a lot of dieback on many of our urban trees from the impacts of the drought, the impact on construction, and in particular, the impact from the optical fiber installation, which caused a fair amount of damage to our urban trees. We get dieback. So it's very important to know what trees you're looking at and what symptoms. Unfortunately, this Fusarium fungus does disrupt the vascular system and the flow of water and nutrients to the tree, and that's why you get these diebacks. Other symptoms are not always obvious. You know, we look for those early symptoms on signs of dieback and look for the evidence of our shot hole borer holes and report anything. One of my personal gripes at the moment and focused on tree is boxel and maple. The Californians and the Western Australians very soon realized that this is one of the primary trees. Unfortunately, in California, this is what they call a native or indigenous tree to their environment. So it's something that should occur in these areas, even though it was introduced to the West Coast into California from central North America. It grows extremely quickly. It's actually quite a beautiful tree, but unfortunately, it's got an extremely high sugar content, being in the maple family, and is a perfect source for the growing of the fungus that supports this beetle. So Australia started very early in 2021 by actually asking citizens to locate Acinogunda trees within their properties and to monitor them. And they've got almost 50 full-time monitors, which is unheard of, really. It's world-class what they're doing over there. But what we realized very soon here is that boxelma maples, being a highly susceptible reproductive host, typically die within 2 years of the shot borer attack, and they can amplify these PSHB populations to surrounding trees, which is one of the main reasons why a lot of arborists have actually requested people to preemptively remove them. But if they're not going to be preemptively removed, they can still be used for monitoring purposes. So if you do ever suspect that you have beetle, please contact the City of Cape Town. These folks have got 5 years of experience on the ground. They've been instrumental in the discovery and management of these trees. They have located close to 20,000 infested trees across the city. Unfortunately, many of these trees are on private land, which they can't manage, but they will come out and ascertain whether or not your tree is infested and give you advice on how best to manage it. You're welcome to email them, invasive.species@capetown.gov.za, and you can do a search on the Cape Town portal for invasive species, and that'll bring you to their portal. Please, they're a good bunch of folks. They know what they're doing. Let's support them in the process. So, what is an amplifier tree? In America, they determine an amplifier tree is a tree which has got more than 150 active entry holes and has dieback. It's a massive source of beetles. It's got a compromised vascular system. Many times it can become hazardous and branches can fall. And these trees require removal and stump grinding. Unfortunately, there is no way to manage this when the beetles get to this point, specifically in our highly susceptible species. And we run a risk of branches actually falling and trees being undermined as they die. So we really need to be cautious about this. And this is why the removal of amplifier trees is recommended. So getting down to the correct disposal of infested material. This is not a case of picking up some guy on the side of the road with a chainsaw to come help you. We're dealing with something that needs specialized management over here. So what the researchers indicated, and it's why the management protocols have recommended this, is that chipping under 3 centimeters kills 99.9% of the beetles. Unfortunately, it only takes one beetle to start a new infestation. But realistically speaking, most arborists don't have chippers that can chip under 3 centimeters, and they chip under 8 centimeters, and that kills 98% of the beetle, which is a good start. Chipping and solarizing will kill 100% of the beetle. Logs or blockwood also needs to be solarized. And if these things are being transported, preferably not, but if they are, they always need to be covered in transport. Now, the chipping operation is extremely dirty, as you can see on the left-hand side over here. But chipping into a covered truck is a good way to ensure it doesn't spread, and cleaning around the area after the operation and sweeping up is a good way to do it. It seems to be that the impact of the chipper is what is killing the beetles, not the actual removal of their food. Once everything's been chipped, and in this case at Newlands Rugby, we left it a massive ace in the gunda. We left it in situ because there was they couldn't afford to have it incinerated at that point. But we did manage this massive 15-meter, 1.2-meter diameter stem diameter ace in the gunda, the box alder at Newlands Rugby, which we think is the primary source of the infestation. More than likely came from firewood brought from Somerset West. The third picture over here is the first infestation we picked up in Newlands, and we weren't able to chip it all. We weren't equipped, and we wrapped everything in plastic. Very soon thereafter, a partnership with the City of Cape Town, Sustainable Heating, and the Cape Arborist Association resulted in us having access to an incineration facility in Claremont Kenilworth area, which takes chip and produces it into steam for a bakery. Unfortunately, this is on a very secured facility, and only really registered companies are able to go in there and drop off. So it's not a public drop-off area. But I mean, why do we actually have to go to such an effort to manage this? Trees that are heavily infested are not going to survive. They're going to continue to emit more and more beetles, which attack trees around them unnecessarily. As these amplifiers die and they emit these millions of beetles, these beetles fly in every direction and basically attack anything. And if a tree is stressed and its immune system and defenses are not strong, it's more than likely going to be able to host the beetle, even if it's not a reproductive host species. So this is why the international best standard has been to manage it in this way. The Californians do it this way, the Israelis do it this way. It's been recommended to do it this way. In South Africa, only really Cape Town has led the charge in this respect, and Perth, looking at all of us and following us, have instituted this same issue, even though they're struggling to manage this beetle. They're doing their best efforts, and that's why we incinerate it. Currently, the incineration is preferred because we don't have a close by designated drop-off facility to manage this wood. But unfortunately, a lot of people are going to take the rock bottom price and hire somebody off the side of the road to cut these trees, or even do them themselves. And this is problematic because that firewood can enter the firewood system and be moved around the city, and it's these loads are generally not covered in transport. So it's not as expensive as people have made it out to be. It's relatively affordable. It does take into consideration the fact that we need to practice biosecurity once we've finished. It requires us to strip our equipment down, clean our vehicles out, clean our chippers out, and ensure that we don't spread this. On the left-hand side, he has a management operation of a Cape Town arborist who managed in Somerset West, and it was a 3 to 4 day operation of removing about 40 highly infested trees. and shipping them and moving them on the site, which required a heavy decontamination afterwards. It gets really down to the point where we actually have to clean out clothing, shoes, to ensure that we don't move this beetle around. It's actually a hell of a thing to actually clean up afterwards. But people, this is, the operators are getting really good at this, and this is why it's so complex. It's also important that the arborists clean their equipment on a regular basis so that they're not passing on other pathogens they might inadvertently pick up when pruning from trees. So it's actually recommended that you at least clean your chainsaw guide bar or your pruning equipment with a sterilizing agent. And the one that's most at hand for arborists is their 2-stroke petrol mix, is to actually just brush your bar off and clean it out and run your machine before moving on to the next operation. So the green waste is a bit of an issue. Now, historically, arborists would basically chip and then either sell that chip or spread the waste as much as possible. The blockwood would go to in the firewood cycle, the chip would go to composting operations, or get sold or dropped off at the Ardennes. If it came within a kilometer of the Ardennes gardens historically, we would take in that chip. But as the infestation has spread, this has been a bit of a problem for us, because one beetle is on average, about 5 liters of firewood that has been chipped to 8 centimeters from a heavily infested tree. So that can start a new infestation. And if we have a look at a cubic meter of mulch chipped at 8 centimeters, there's on average about 300 beetles in that. So this is not ideal to basically move around infested chips. So this has become a bit of a concern too. Specifically because gardens and arboretum are heavily reliant upon mulch as a primary source of fertilization for our trees and feeding healthy soil. So yeah, this is why we need to incinerate these things. So number 6, firewood remains the primary pathway for this. The infestation in Somerset West resulted in firewood brought from George. The infestation in Newlands resulted in firewood brought from Nozama outside Somerset West. So the informal sector is unfortunately primarily responsible for this, because the formal guys focus on mostly trucking in their firewood. So most of our eucalyptus and blackwood gets trucked in from outside Cape Town. The problem kind of comes in is when there's informal guys working, or for example, on the right-hand side, this is a City of Cape Town truck in the Ardennes Gardens. And in the early phases of this, we really struggled to kind of ask the yard guys to change their behavior, because they pretty much reliant upon firewood for heating their homes and heating themselves at the yard during winter. There's no, you can't really use a heater, and these folks work outdoors the whole day. So it really became a bit of an abrasive relationship in the early days of biosecurity implementation, specifically at the Ardennes Gardens, unfortunately, because of the traditional firewood culture that all of us have. I've even got firewood, these albeit safe firewood, in my yard. And the other issue is that a lot of firewood that's coming out of informal systems, like the middle photograph over here with this 4x4, and this is coming out of the Greyton areas, that there's actually quite a few powder post beetles, which are economically and structurally concerning to our houses, that are being transported in. So the general rule of thumb when it comes to firewood is don't move firewood, buy it where you burn it and sell it where you cut it. So yeah, false hope. There's a lot of people out there that are willing to take your money, for lack of a better word. Let's refer to them as charlatans who sell a snake oil. We've seen this time and time again. We had Thabo Mbeki in his lowest moments promoting Viridine, while the rest of the world was, trying to manage immunization, healthcare, and antiretroviral treatments. South Africa really made an embarrassing name for itself with Viridine. And this was another snake oil. And we saw this really recently with ivermectin during COVID, where people were literally rubbing themselves top to tail in a vermicide, something which is designed to kill parasites in the body. And then we started to see in Somerset West these buckets appearing in trees. And these oaks were mixing who knows what into these buckets. The one on the left-hand side over here was a guy who used this as an advertisement on a city tree within 30 meters of a watercourse. This was actually so dangerous that we needed to get the fire department to come out in full hazmat suits to remove this. This has since stopped, but it is very concerning when you have these buckets at height with who knows what in them. And some of these mixtures, never mind being carcinogenic, could actually be mutagenic and affect the DNA and even create birth defects in our offspring. So you need to be very cautious in this regard. As the video said earlier, there is no effective, legal, or safe treatment currently registered for PSHB or Fusarium urulaceae on ornamental or agricultural crops. So, you know, this is a picture of George, photographed by Professor Wilhelm de Beer from Fabi. And this was what he started to see as a pathologist and entomologist and mycologist, going to visit his family in George. And he started to see more and more trees dying. And George municipality, unfortunately, didn't manage this very well. They basically just chopped the wood down, and they didn't have the chipping facilities. And they basically left it on the ground. And this is where people would basically come and take this wood and use it as firewood. And this is actually how it got to Somerset West. And you can see a lot of dieback in these trees. And I would hazard a guess today that there isn't an English oak left in George. So we need to manage it better. George municipality actually went to the point of putting up these posters on trees. Beware of falling branches. There was just no real plan at that point to manage it. And yeah, and what we've been seeing in Johannesburg after the storms is it's also due to not as effective management of this problem, is that a lot of dead and dying trees get blown over in storms. So yeah, it's going to get worse before it gets better, but no one died yet. So what can you as a landowner really do to your tree? These are the beautiful camphors at the pond on the Arden Gardens. We have to, unfortunately, paint them with grey paint to stop bark harvesting, which is just one of the, it's not actually got anything to do with PSHB while we're doing this. It's mostly dealing with other problems, because bark harvesting is a real problem. But when you come to cultural management, specifically with trees, don't use high nitrogen fertilizers. Nitrogen is just going to create a rapid growth and make these trees more susceptible to insects. Insects love nitrogen. Don't overwater your tree. Trees require water, but they don't require as much. People can actually overcare for their trees in many ways. Don't underwater it. A water-stressed tree is not a happy tree. Please don't use herbicides in your tree's root zones. Trees' root zones extend at least 12.5 times the diameter of the tree outwards. Don't excavate in your tree's root zones. If you do so very carefully, because unfortunately, like with optical fiber, this can negatively affect trees. And the other thing is, don't compact trees. We all enjoy shade, but please don't park your car under a tree. That's actually creating negative damage to it. So how can you help? Last year, we kind of, during the city's bio challenge, together with invasive species unit and a couple of citizen scientists, we actually started a box elder monitoring project. And we were asking folks to go out there and record their box elder maples using an app called iNaturalist, and to monitor these trees to predict PSHB pathways better. iNaturalist is an app, can be downloaded from Apple Play Store or Apple app or the Google Play Store. The reason we focused on the box elder is because of the new data coming out of Perth, and it's a highly susceptible species. It's also a species that is spread to almost every neighborhood in the leafy suburbs of Cape Town. It's distributed by wind, and it loves water systems and has grown in almost, I would say, 1 out of 3 gardens in Cape Town in the leafy suburbs. It can grow on the Cape Flats, it can grow anywhere. But the box elder in particular has, been proven to be problematic. And there's other families that are concerned, other maples. We got willows and poplars, the castor oil, the oaks, the what we call the peel or the bean or Fabaceae family. Things like acacias and kibbems and celerias, and then we got the plane trees, the sycamores, and then the liquid ambers. So early on, we also started to realize there's a lot of lookalike species here as we were getting folks to go out there, and a lot of these folks were either trained naturalists or had spent a fair amount of time working in pest identification. And we started to pick up a lot of lookalikes. So the first step to successful management is to try to identify this pest properly. Unfortunately, there's a lot of lookalikes. So the easiest way to kind of determine it is using a ballpoint pen and the size. So that hole is actually, it doesn't look like it. It's a little bit bigger than that borehole pen size over there. And this was a secondary beetle attacking dead wood. But it also looked like there were galleries on this. And this is a liquid amber in Somerset West. And what we were seeing over here was that the beetle was attacking not the dead wood. Remember, it doesn't attack dead wood, it only attacks live wood. Was attacking the live wood around this calloused area of the liquid amber. And for some reason, this beetle loves to attack around canker areas, mostly because the tree's defense system was not very effective. And this turned out not to be shot hole borer. This was another borer, which is a little bit smaller. But what you see over here is this noodling coming out of the liquid amber. So there's quite a few lookalikes. So within our Afro-temperate sister, Afro-montane, we've got a bark beetle called Scolyplatypus. This one in particular likes to focus on Vigilia. It is almost identical to the shot hole borer, except it's a lot wider. It's actually 2.25 centimeters long, and it creates the same system, the same sort of symptoms. So we've got copious gumming, oozing, sap, thrash, and galleries, but it is larger than the beetle. So one of the ways that the scientists have actually been unscientifically telling the difference is by using toothpicks. So this beetle over here is of a great concern for Vigilia, but it's an Afro-temperate species and it can attack other trees. So this is, we generally get a false positive on this, but it's easy to, with the trained eye, tell the difference. One of the ones that's going to give us our biggest false positives in the urban area is a cosmopolitan beetle called the lesser shot hole or fruit pinhole borer called Xylobarinus saxoni. Now, this beetle is almost identical to the shot hole borer, with the exception of the fact that it's a lot smaller. The holes are about 1/2 mil, so generally 1/5 of a teaspoon, and it's almost identical, except it carries a different fungus. So the Xylobarini carries a fungus called Raphaella, and the Raphaella fungus is a pathogen, and it produces slightly different staining. It's a lot darker than the Fusarium urulacea. But unfortunately, it looks exactly the same on plane trees, except it's more dispersed. And even the trained eye can't really tell the difference until they biopsy. But it's easy enough when you know what you're looking for to tell the difference. And they only attack stressed and dying trees. You will find them attacking fruit trees in particular that are stressed in the urban environment, and quite visually on plane trees. This beetle does not require to be mated to lay offspring. It also enters and exits through the same hole in a tree. It forms a fungus that it carries with us as its food source for its offspring. All unmated eggs are male. It then mates with its offspring. So it's very similar. That's why it's in the same family. And then a lot more difficult to pick up with these lookalikes is the pathogenic bacteria, and specifically on avocado. But what we'll see when we do a biopsy, there's no entry or exit holes, and then the exudate or bleeding or sugary volcanoes tend to have a little bit more of a reddish tinge to it. One of the false positives we see is physical injury. I actually arrived home to a fig tree after visiting Somerset West at my home, and saw that there were what looked like entry exit holes and exudate running over it. It just happened to be that somebody had swung a spade and turned out to be a false positive. But there's a lot of false positives can happen. Excuse me. In Stellenbosch University in Victoria Road, they initially thought they had problems with the plane trees there, and it actually turned out that a lot of the holes that looked like shot hole borer holes were actually holes from staples. The students were then stapling flyers to the trees. There was also then a beetle attacking those trees, which turned out to be Xylobori saxoni, which was also a false positive. But it was also the mechanical aspects of staples, nails, spades, injection sites. But there are ways to kind of tell the difference. You've got to figure out whether or not there was recent strimmer damage to the area or mowing, or whether or not somebody was working in that tree. And using that ballpoint pen again, this over here was mechanical damage from a spade on a tree. So the surveillance and monitoring basically is the most effective way for us to get early detection over here. It's one of the key aspects to controlling PSHB, at least managing it. And fortunately, the visual detection can be quite difficult in the early stages over here. This is a liquid amber in Somerset West, and it is being infested by the beetle, but it's very early on and quite hard to detect. So it does require a bit of a trained eye, which kind of brought us to how we got about discovering this infestation that we found in Newlands. Luckily enough, one of a fellow arborist had the wherewithal to actually contact Cricket Tree Services, and because of their involvement in the Ardern Gardens as managing there, and in Somerset West with the shot hole borer, to go out and figure out what was going on with this tree. And that's why on the 27th of January, we found that the shot hole borer had arrived in Kildare on box elder trees. And what I started to do at that point was using our naturalists to actually go out and monitor it. So we very soon after picked up an infested tree at Newlands Stadium, and then very soon after that, the city started to pick up infested trees along Main Road across from Rustenburg Junior Girls School on the bottom by the Baxter Theatre at Saks. And then, and I can kick myself for this, about 2 weeks earlier, on my way to Stock Ayres to get some stock for the garden, I spotted a box elder in dieback, and I just thought to myself, man, that's got to be PSHB. And I was just too busy. I was on a tight deadline, and I kind of forgot about it and went back on the 28th of January to verify that it actually was shot hole borer. There's nothing really we could have done. It had obviously been there for possibly 6 months. More than likely from firewood brought in elsewhere, but it's hard to tell where this infestation started. This one here, over here, we don't know how it started, but we know that the Newlands one was firewood, and Kildare, we're not quite sure. But if we have a look at the Liesbeek River over here, it was more than likely moving along that. So that brings us to the 27th of February, where together on the weekends, my long-suffering partner and I would go out and on the weekends, instead of relaxing, go out and spot these trees using our naturalists. And what we really started to pick up was the fact that it was moving along streams. So this is the Cannon or Newlands Spring, and right up to the top of Palmboom, some heavily infested trees. We started to pick them up in Saks and on Dean Street, and then we started to get a massive amount of infested trees in and around Newlands Rugby Sports Science Centre, and literally all the way along the railway line and the Liesbeek to the Baxter Theatre, and then further on to Mowbray. It was actually, our naturalist was really effective in being able to tell a story. And the fact is that this information is publicly available if you choose it to be. You can obscure the locations, but in general, it's effective up to about 4 to 10 meters. And it starts to paint a picture of the infestation. One of the kind of comparisons, and this goes on from the initial call to monitor Ace and Agunda, which resulted in a lot of data coming in here. Admittedly, I've probably monitored around 400 of these trees, is that we've got a high percentage of box elders. And if we have a look at where they are, this will be this is Rondebosch Park area here, not as many box elders, but if we get into the old suburbs of Rondebosch and into Belvedere area over here, we start to get quite a few, but the large amounts of them that we've actually monitored are in the upper Mowbray area into Rondebosch, and then into the areas of Newlands, Kenilworth, Wynberg, and Claremont. Furthermore, they stretch all the way down into Constantia. And the reason we don't have so much data for Constantia and for the same amount of area into Takai is that these are only trees that have been monitored from the road. So there could be a lot more species over here. And if we now have a look at the infestation on the right-hand side over here, it's more than likely following, pretty much, I think it is following the Ace and the Gunda as the stepping stones for this infestation. This is why arborists have been recommending the removal of Ace and the Gunda, because it's literally the canary in the coal mine, or Russian roulette, if you look at it from a different way. If you're not monitoring it, it's probably easier to have it removed. But yeah, this is proven to be the easiest way to detect it is on Ace and the Gunda. This infestation over here is on Valley Road in Kenilworth, and smack bang in the middle over here is the Ardennes Gardens. We're literally surrounded. So this kind of took us to have a look and see what was going on elsewhere. And by following specifically what's going on in California, we saw that the University of California's Agricultural and Natural Resources Department had been setting up a project to monitor for this. And sometimes it's not worth reinventing the wheel. So we basically went and had a look at what was going on with their project and kind of figured out why we would want to do this. And what they're very interested in recording, which we initially thought was not, and I say we as those involved in this, is we didn't really know why they wanted these things. But as it turned out, it was very important to take a few photographs so that people who weren't there and are then verifying these identifications of the right information to do so. So they were looking to take pictures of the bark of the tree, the leaf, a full photo of the tree with a landmark, which was really important, so that they could find it secondary to do ground truthing on these possible sightings, and then a close-up of the beetle entry exit hole with a pen for scale. And then they were looking for the symptoms, visible signs of gumming, staining, presence of fast or sugary exudates. And then additional things that they were basically looking for is they were looking for only focusing on one species. And there was a whole bunch of other data that they wanted to catch. They wanted to catch what host tree it was, what the diameter of the tree was, what the height of the tree was, the level of infestation, whether it's low, moderate, heavy, or severe, and looking for any additional information from the field that could be useful in managing this. And this was as much to assist with the ground truthing of it, but it was also, there was a secondary benefit from this, because the information captured specifically on street trees, which are in the public domain, and for example, in Cape Town or in other areas like Stellenbosch or Paarl, would be managed by the line department within the municipality responsible for that. And this type of data can be really helpful, because it can assist in informing them how many trees are infested, what species of trees infested, what size they are, and what height they are, which determines the amount of biomass that's going to be generated from it, or the technical difficulty in managing this. So we decided to kind of look a little bit further as to why, and what we found from them is that generally online training, for example, that you've received today, is only about 83% successful. And in California, by the way, they call it invasive shot hole borer because they have more than one species. We only have one. And what they find is that the in-person, kind of the online combined with the in-person in-field training had a 96% success rate in this. So it's very important that I think people get a good basis online, and then in time develop an in-field training to truly be able to tell the difference for this. So kind of how field monitoring it's proven to be a very effective way on spotting infections within the city. The city of Cape Town, together with their permanent employees and expanded public works employees who are on anything from a 6 months to a 1.5-year contract, basically go out and deal with the public and monitor for this beetle, and they're getting very good at it. And they're a beautiful bunch of folks, by the way. And so far, the city has been able to basically identify and remove 4,000 highly infested trees using this method, which is absolutely incredible. Well done to them. So all this data, and that was gathered through the citizen science efforts within Cape Town from the 27th of February, actually to date, resulted in the ability for us to actually determine where the primary infestation zone was, which is this area over here in pink, which stretches literally all the way from Settlers Way. It's now jumped Settlers Way, from Settlers Way, the N2, to, let's call it Campground Palmyra Road. It hasn't really jumped below the train line in Claremont and Kenilworth as yet. It's kind of still restricted to Newlands, so it isn't officially in Claremont, but it does stretch all the way up into Newlands, pretty much down to the M3. And then the Kenilworth outbreak pretty much stretches from the Trailway line all the way through to Indian Road, and then up to Main Road, and then down towards just about Harfield Village. So once again, the Ardern Garden sits right in the middle. So if we to anticipate the movement of this beetle, we basically need to have a look at firstly our primary and secondary infestation zones, because these are two different sources of infestation. And then the leading edge of this. And the leading edge is determined as expected where the beetle is, the possibility of moving within the next season, which will basically be starting in around October and will carry on until about May of next year. It's anticipated that this beetle will move up into the upper UCT campus, above Rhodes Mem, into Sandparks area, above the firebase, and into Newlands Forest. It's also anticipated that it'll basically move as far as Wynberg Park and pretty much down to the Alphen Trail, which is a collection of highly susceptible trees, which will more than likely be a stepping stone for the infestation into Upper Cecilia Forest. So it's very concerning when we basically have a look at what it's going to do. And all of this data was pretty much collected by citizen scientists. So how you folks can get involved is you guys can get involved by having a look at PSHB Update on Instagram. Also got a Twitter handle over there, and on Facebook for regular updates. My name is Paul Barker, and thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Paul. What a detailed and information-filled presentation. Thank you for sharing that with us. And it does paint a pretty bleak picture of the potential spread of this pest, and a call to action for everybody who can get involved and do what we can to control this. I think we're going to go to some questions now. If you do have questions, as I say, please put them in the Q&A box and we can answer them there. Onako is saying, was the beetle not found in 2019 in Somerset West? I think you covered it was earlier than that.
Yeah, so I mean, look, it was there for a while before it was discovered. It was discovered in the Aldenland area. The wood was brought. We were able to contact trace where it come from. So we were able to talk to the individuals involved. They had brought cordwood, which is slices of wood for beautiful slices of massive oak trees from George, which they thought would be beautiful as a table or stepping stones in their garden. And you know, this is how it got there, and you know, it was bound to happen. And then from there, it focused on a box elder, Aesanogunda once again, canary on the coal mine. And then basically it had probably been there from, could have been as early as 2017, but it's a good guesstimate to say that it came in 2018 and we only picked it up in 2019.
Great. Kenny is up in KwaZulu-Natal, the general manager of Latuli Private Game Reserve, and he's asked, can the beetle be introduced through raw lumber for construction?
Look, Kenny, as long as you're using lumber that is from non-susceptible species. So if the beetle doesn't exist in your area, using the local lumber is generally fine. The concern is not in pine, not in gum. That's not our concern area here. Our concern is in things like wattle. So in and amongst, Richards Bay is pretty much the epicenter of where we think the beetle came in. There's actually a second variety of the beetle found there. And there's also an indigenous Uwalacea called, what is it now? Xanthopus, which occurs in the natural forest systems around Richards Bay. So wattle would be a concern, even though it hasn't proven to be a major problem yet in commercial wattle plantations, but it is anticipated to be. But if you're using pine and gum, it's not a concern. But I wouldn't bother using untreated wood for construction purposes, because both wattle and pine, wattle and gum are susceptible to a lot of our indigenous borer beetles. But if you are using wood harvested locally, if you're unsure, wrap it in plastic and sweat it for 6 weeks in summer. That should kill the beetle.
Great, thank you. Onaka's got a question here. How can we identify a non-active hole?
You can put latex paint over it. You can paint it with PVA. If the beetle requires the hole to be open, it'll open it up within minutes. It'll come out and open it up. So this is a technique they're using. Now, generally, this is only really used on things like plane trees. Plane trees take a long time to go. They're robust trees. The legend is that they were imported for the use of siege material. I don't necessarily believe that, but they're very good urban trees and they can handle it. But they are extremely dense and robust and strong. And a tree like that can take a long time to die. But from what we're seeing in Johannesburg is these trees are dying. So, you know, it might take 8 to 10 years to die, but in that process, it becomes this massive source of propagular pressure, which affects the environment around us unnecessarily.
Sure. An anonymous attendee has asked, are there any effective chemical treatments available in other countries, or is it worldwide that there's nothing that's effective?
Look, there's chemical trials underway with the University of Stellenbosch. It's not looking encouraging from what I can say. And a lot of these trials are replicated stuff that was trialed in the States. Now, there are effective treatments for avocado, agricultural crops in Israel and California, but these are not registered for use in ornamental crops. Now, remember, we live in an environment where we grow ornamental plants. You can't take a treatment protocol from California or Israel and utilize it in your garden because you aren't living in a commercial orchard. A commercial orchard is a lot easier to manage than an island within a sea or a forest of many numerous trees, which could be continuously infesting you. So it also doesn't make logical sense for us to treat something that spends 99% of its time inside a tree. It doesn't eat the tree, it only farms the fungus within it. And there's almost no way to get anything into it. And from what we've seen of people attempting to manage this in Somerset West, is we've seen unnecessary poisonings. We've seen the death of beloved pets. We've seen the absolute and total nuclear annihilation of every single living insect in gardens. And there's nothing targeted for us. So the way that we're looking to manage it, the way that science is looking to manage it, is through the introduction of biocontrols. An insect or a fungus or a nematode that has the ability to either focus on attacking the insect itself or the food source that it lives off. But there is no registered, safe, or legal chemical in South Africa for this. And we got to remember that forestry, agriculture, and ornamentals are very different crops. A forestry crop does not require as much toxicity data for a product as an agricultural crop does, because we eat that food. But an agricultural crop doesn't require as much toxicity data as an ornamental crop, because an ornamental crop is grown in our homes and in our gardens and in our neighborhoods. And we can't go drenching the soil with heavy neonicotinoid poisons or spraying our trees with pyrethroids and not expect that we're going to negatively impact our groundwater or our environment around us, and inadvertently maybe even poison our neighbors or our own children.
True. Nicole Mayers asked, has the infestation been identified on trees at Kirstenbosch Botanic Gardens and or Ardern?
Our monitoring traps at the Ardern currently are empty. We did intercept through static monitoring beetle in the stone cottages on the 27th of April or 24th of April. That was confirmed through morphological identification by the University of Stellenbosch, and it's also been DNA verified that it is the same species that we've found throughout the country. So it's not a different species of Eulacea. It hasn't been identified in trees yet, being the fact that it was intercepted in stone cottages means that it was either due to its proximity with Rhodes Drive, that it was infested material was transported along Rhodes Drive, or it might be in the currently unmanaged Boschenhevel Arboretum below. The city no longer owns that property, so the city can't actually actively manage it. But what you do have is you do have a high amount of susceptible species in poplars and oaks. And as over the next 2 years, that area could inadvertently become an uncontrollable source of beetles to the Bishop's Court and Kirstenbosch if it isn't managed. But there are larger concerns we actually have to really worry about, and that's it's more of the public works lands, the Genadendal estate in Upper Rondebosch, the Fernwood Parliamentary Estate in Newlands. Those are places that have not been effectively managed for many decades and have got a high prevalence of stressed, dying, and susceptible tree species there. So this is very much a disease of the leafy suburbs.
Jeremy's got a few questions here, so I'll run through them quickly. Is the beetle dormant in winter? Are the public trees monitored by the ISU, or do they only react to phone calls? And how should we be monitoring? And he's talking about the street trees that he normally walks past and checks on. Sort of how often should we be monitoring?
Okay, so the beetle tends to be dormant under 19 degrees Celsius. Anything over that moves. So for example, right now, hopefully, if we go down to 4 or 5 degrees, it will kill the beetle if it's outside. But if it's in the warmth and protection of a tree, it's basically enjoying its little orgy and building up its populations and living at home. It's got food. It doesn't need to go out. There's no one to attack it. It has to leave in winter. It's like Cape Town. Everybody disappears. You go indoors. The beetle's the same. It's not going away, but it doesn't become dormant as such. But it isn't moving. But if we have a beautiful 21 degrees in the middle of winter, the beetle will emerge. So it moves all year, but it's within that temperature zone. Public trees remain the domain of the City of Cape Town. The City of Cape Town is an invasive species unit, invasives.species at capetown.gov.za. They are extremely happy to come out and verify if you suspect that there is an infested tree. Okay. Don't worry about pepper trees, don't worry about pine trees, and don't worry about gum trees, and don't worry about dead wood. Worry about live wood and symptoms. Right now, unfortunately, and this is the other funny thing about this beetle, it tends to have, for some reason, is focused on the Mediterranean climate. Even though it's spread across South Africa into all of the major cities as it stands right now, which is the largest infestation on the planet and will more than likely extend up into southern Africa, unfortunately. And we don't really know what the effects of that are going to be. But it tends to be a bit of a disease in the Mediterranean climate. So what becomes very challenging during our winter or our rainy months is that it becomes hard to monitor for the beetle. It tends to wash the symptoms away on the tree. So monitoring efforts tend to start in around October. They peak in around February, March, and then they dip down into about May. With regards to managing the public trees, it's the invasive species job to co-manage city trees. They manage them on behalf of the Parks and Recreation Department, which are the custodians of Cape Town's open space trees. Did that answer it all?
And then just how often should we be monitoring? And you've answered that, yeah. So
as often as you can. You know, it's how I've developed it is I know where the highly susceptible trees are. For example, if you have a look around the Ardennes Gardens, we've actually gone to each of the property landowners and owners of those trees around the areas, and we've actually offered to pay for a percentage of the removal of those box elders because we realize that it's going to be such a propagal threat to the Ardennes. But that's not always the case. But generally, if you're worried about your environment and your neighborhood around it, is create routes that have got the most susceptible species on them. Generally look from ankle height up to shoulder height is where you're going to find your infestations. You're going to pick them up quicker on box elder trees and plane trees quicker than you are on oak trees, because oak trees, just by their nature, are very difficult to pick up on. But in those months, as often as possible, and if you see sightings, either become part of an iNaturalist project, but always report to the city of Cape Town, over and above getting involved with the iNaturalist side of things.
Perfect, thank you. When Wendy pays these asks, does it affect the jacaranda?
It does affect jacaranda. In Pretoria, the jacaranda are getting nailed quite hard, but you've also got to take into consideration the implementation of optical fiber. So it's not always the case. I mean, trees, it's quite variable. It's not always going to say that the less susceptible species are going to be attacked in the same way that they are in Pretoria, where they've been, a road tree has been affected by optical fiber, as opposed to a tree on a property which is nurtured, cared for. It doesn't get attacked as carefully. So it indicates that the more stressed trees are and the more negative impact there is upon them, the earlier they're going to be attacked. But jacaranda does get attacked, but it's not officially a reproductive host species in South Africa. So it is actually a tree that is being considered for replanting.
Right. Catherine Palmer, double barrel question here. How can we put pressure on the powers to be to enforce control over the movement of wood, as well as monitoring the disposal of wood at general recycling centres?
Yeah, I don't know. Unless you can tell Barbara Creasy what to do, there's very little chance of having any kind of like movement of firewood. You've also got to take into consideration that if we start restricting the movement of firewood, we're affecting the poorest of the poor. A lot of people sustainably harvest firewood as a livelihood, and to take that away from them is going to have negative impacts on hundreds of people, thousands, if not. Firewood is a massive concern. You've seen massive deforestation of woodland in Gauteng around Hartbeespoort Dam, which is negative from an environmental perspective, but might actually slow the beetle movement further into the Rustenburg area because of it. The concerns with movement of wood is now the Dichrostachys crenea, which is the sickle wood, which is quite a good firewood, is now a reproductive host species. So the movement of that across the country is a concern. Black wattle is a reproductive host species, so the movement of that is a concern, but it's also about where the wood's coming from. If the wood's coming from the George area, there's more of a concern if the wood is coming from the Greyton, Caledon, Storms River or Hans Bay area, for example, where the beetle doesn't occur. The largest risk to the movement of firewood, I don't think, is firewood coming, at least conventional firewood. We're talking about gum, pine, and the wattle species. I don't see the threat to Cape Town as an external threat. I see the threat of firewood within Cape Town as an internal threat. I think the powers that be, which are currently they're currently not implementing this, is to basically form a quarantine on firewood leaving Cape Town more than firewood entering Cape Town. The largest threat that we have is firewood leaving Somerset West into the Grabouw-Elgin area, into our fruit growing sectors, or into Villersdorp, because this beetle is proving to be very challenging to manage in fruit orchards. So there is that concern. The powers that be, how to put pressure on them? I've squeezed hard. I find it's easier to develop working relationships than it is to tell people what to do. You know, develop things, present it to them, let them own it. I think the strategy of harassing politicians doesn't really get anywhere. I think in Michelle Obama's autobiography, she put it very well. They said that they realized halfway through their first term in government that they weren't going to be able to make any sustainable change to the bureaucracy of the US government. And I think in many ways, politicians who are here for 5 years, they are enthusiastic and have the ability to affect some change, but they're not going to affect the overall minutiae of civil service. And civil service has a way of going through its processes. And right now, everything is, and specifically with firewood, is all around legal matters and how that law affects the poor.
Well, I think work together rather than against, I think is good
absolutely.
is good advice. Thomas Hope's question here: the London plane trees in Parkview, Johannesburg, are extremely infested, and the trees fall down after the storms. There's a lot of top die-off, and all the trunks have a shotgun pattern. There's no management of this by the Joburg Council. And then, what do you recommend in terms of a replacement strategy of the trees? The white stinkwood, and then can the wood from the gums that are from the London plains, can that be burnt locally as a minor control?
Well, burning firewood, burning infested wood is problematic, because the minute the beetles have smoke, they leave. And they've been able to fly up to 400 meters in labs, and on average they'll fly about 50 meters around an infested tree. Joburg unfortunately started to manage this in the right way, but the residents of Johannesburg took the piss, which created a massive fallback in managed material. So the city of Joburg also had quite an antagonistic relationship with the arborists. Instead of working together, there was this fighting system. You should do this, you should do this, you should do this. I think in Cape Town, it's been a very different approach to how we've gone about it, is we've collaborated right from the beginning. And instead of publicly shaming or even personally shaming, try to find solutions on how to do this. And you can always find fault in whatever people do. But the most effective strategy that we have here is the one I'd recommend for any city that's capable of doing it. Identify infested trees, remove them safely, chip them and contain them, move them safely in transport, and take them to a designated drop-off facility that can either compost or solarize them. I think we're missing a massive opportunity to create a large amount of beneficial mulch and compost for our regrowing attempts into the future. When it comes to regrowing attempts, I'm not going to recommend any trees. I'll recommend what not to plant, but I think there's legal concerns around recommending to people what they should plant. From what I'm planting at the moment, is we are continuing to plant oak trees, but of different species, to see whether or not they are susceptible or they have resistance, which is nothing better to do, really. I continue to plant conifer trees, but some species of conifers are susceptible to other pathogens and other insects. I'm not planting any gum trees at the moment, because we do have existing gums that we have in the Arboretum that are potentially resisted, but we'll see how that happens in time. I plant very differently to other people do. Indigenous trees that we have planted as screening, we're planting a lot of Apodytes dimidiata at the moment, which is the hard pear. Beautiful tree, produces a massive amount of fruit, but you can't really recommend something unless it's gone through an academic process. So the Center for Invasion Biology, or at least the Center for Excellence in Invasion Biology at the University of Stellenbosch, or Stellenbosch University, is currently busy with an academic desktop study around having a look at numerous factors around trees. They're having a look at its susceptibility, not only to PSHB and the Fusarium, but its susceptibility to other emerging pest pathogen complexes, and some of them which haven't arrived in South Africa yet, because in the future, this is only one of many invasive pests we'll have. The other thing they're looking into is whether or not it's a tree that's adapted to the local climate, whether it's a tree that's adapted to use around buildings, whether it has amenity values, whether it's going to be in conflict with overhead power lines. So we basically trying to, in a very short period of time, come up with a lot of scientific data when there's been absolutely nothing pumped into trees by the Department of Forestry, other than the Champion Tree Project, which is like highlighting what we've done in the past. There hasn't really been any active planting of trees on a large scale undertaken anywhere in South Africa in the past 40 years. So there's no real funding for academia around this. So kind of trees that are safe, and the general distinction is things like the Brisbane box, works really well in Cape Town, and the stone pine. Those are kind of the two trees that are iconic within Cape Town's landscape that have resistance to the beetle, but I can't personally recommend anybody plant anything.
Perfect, Dennis. Kenny has a question. Yeah, you mentioned to avoid important firewood from outside of a protected area. Does this apply to hardwood, such as Dicostaceous or the acacias? Is the beetle capable of boring in the hardwood and then spread further?
Yeah, absolutely. Dichrostrachus crenea can be reproductive. You also, I mean, Dichrostrachus grows in areas that have been heavily grazed. It's a hell of a firewood to manage. I don't know why people manage it as a firewood. I'd rather flail mow it. But hardwood and acacia in particular, or Vauchelia wood, I personally think it's unethical to utilize it, because a lot of it is so-called camel thorn. Alleged camel thorn is coming in from Botswana, Namibia, Mozambique, Zimbabwe. And firstly, a lot of the stuff isn't treated, so it's bringing in new pests. And secondly, a lot of this wood is allegedly illegally harvested and is environmentally irresponsible and morally repugnant to utilize. And the wood on the side of the road, for example, around Hartbeespoort all the way through to Rustenburg, has been stripped within kilometers of the road, and all of that has taken some of them up to 200-300 years to grow. So rather focus on gum, pine, and then black wattle. Those are right now the safest. Generally, the wood you buy in a store, a conventional store, has been dried. So once that wood is dry, it's no longer a concern for the shot hole borer as such. But only burn what you need to use, burn it where you intend to braai, and burn it all, and don't move it around is the safest way to deal with firewood. The Americans reckon they've been unable to even change firewood culture within the residents of California. So I think firewood's just going to kind of move. But if everybody does their bit and puts consumer pressure on the likes of Woolworths, who sells sicklewood, the same for Massmart, Builders, Macro, they still sell sicklewood. You know, it's a tough one.
Okay, fair enough. And then Kelly, second point to Kenny's question was, how concerned should we be if it reaches our national parks and protected areas? As a lot of what we've been dealing with here is about the ornamentals and fruit trees. What is the impact if it gets into our national parks and protected areas?
It is already in national parks and protected areas. We can assume that it's in Table Mountain National Park. It's just not evident. It is in Wilderness National Park. We know that for a fact. There's currently studies going on there. It's in protected areas around Richards Bay, where it's currently being monitored. Kruger National Park is really struggling to maintain a firewood ban within the legitimate procurement processes of any organization. They haven't been able to procure sufficient amounts, sustainable supplies of firewood to fulfill the demand of people entering the park. So the Kruger National Park, merely from the fact that it's such a massive attractant of people and the whole bush experience of firewood. I mean, you know, it's part of the experience. You know, sitting around a charcoal brazier is not going to fulfill that classic in the bush, sitting back with your sundowner and a lekker hardekool fire. So far, to my knowledge, there has been no reported infestation in Kruger National Park. A lot of the firewood is coming from around the park, which is being harvested. But there is the ticking time bomb, which is why it took so long for Cape Nature to react. Now, Kruger Park reacted very quickly within 4 weeks of the demand. At least a call for them to ban firewood, but they've been unable to maintain it just from a logistics perspective. Cape Nature took a lot longer to implement the strategy, but they've got it to the point where you may not bring firewood into a Cape Nature facility, but they have charcoal available for sale. So if you arrive there with firewood, it's basically bagged up and put into a burn box. And which was trialed quite nicely at Grootvaderbos, which was kind of unofficially the first place to do it. So this would be it, but it's the responsibility of each of ourselves to basically either mitigate the risk of it by, you know, like the chairperson of the Friends of the Ardea and Gardens, Francois Krikke. He's the co-owner of Platbos Nature Reserve in Gansbaai, the southernmost dryland forest in Africa. And very soon, even in 2018, as part of a booking process, before you could confirm your booking at Platbos, it was a window used to pop up and say, or does pop up and say, we acknowledge that we may not bring firewood to the reserve. Firewood will be available for sale at the reserve. So it's an early game. We don't want to be the ones to inadvertently introduce this to our protected areas. So just general education around firewood. I wish the likes of Chaka and Weber and the rest of these oaks would kind of really get involved, even though you don't burn wood in a Weber, but charcoal's the best way to go. In closing on the subject, I think the Cape Townians can learn a lot from the Valleys, you know, because whenever we rock up from a braai, we rock up with 2 cases of charcoal, huh? Because your oak firewood over here is not lekker for braaiing. It doesn't make coals. If you want to braai properly, charcoal's the way.
Jenny's asked, will the ACEs ever, the ACE Negunda ever be reclassified to force people to remove them?
It's up for review, but these processes take a long time. Actually, a lot of NEMBA species. Currently, ACE Negunda is being reviewed as a NEMBA 1A. The risk assessment looks positive that it is a removable species, but I think it's a species that we should accept is highly susceptible, and I don't think we should wait for government to do things. I mean, they can hardly provide us with safe roads, electricity, a healthcare system, a safe environment to live in. I don't know why we should wait for the overworked minister, or allegedly, to promulgate that.
For sure. And then last question here from Paul. He just wanted to ask, is there any data about the susceptibility to the infestation of exotic bauhinia and camphor trees? And for myself, what about our yellowwoods?
Yeah. Bauhinia pepperea is a reproductive host species. It's also in the Fusarium group. So it's a bean family. They all share. And the bean family seems to be the one with the highest level of susceptibility. We got Virgilia, We've got Acacia vachellia sebriana. We've got a lot of the acacias, methyloxylon, amongst others. It's also attacking Celeria, Podularia. So it's, I think one needs to watch very carefully. A lot of we'll see sooner or later. We've got quite a few interesting species of Bauhinia in the Ardean Gardens. And over the coming years, we're definitely going to have a lot of new data coming out of us with our existing relationship with SANBI, with the University of Pretoria, University of Stellenbosch, and the International Sentinel Plant Network. So because we're an area of study and we've got at least 400 different species and over 500 trees within the Arboretum, it's going to produce a lot of data. But Bauhinia purpurea, that reproductive host species list, that's your starting point. But I would watch any Fabaceae species very carefully. I think that it's proving time and time again that that's the other one. The next question was around?
Just camphors and yellowwoods.
Camphors. All right. Firstly, on camphors, we need to acknowledge that camphors are an invasive species within a riparian environment. So if you're within 30 to 34 meters of a river system, it's not a good place for you to have a camphor. If you obviously need to take in consideration that you live within a historical protection zone or a local area overlay, which has bylaws pertaining to the trees within your area, you may not remove them without prior permission from council. However, the camphor trees so far, even though they do get attacked, are not a reproductive host species for the beetle. So it is proving to be a good alternative for protected areas. However, you need to consider that it is a very messy tree. The starlings can poop a lot of that stuff all over the place. It is very allopathic, not a lot of grows underneath it. But it is, I'm looking at it and seeing that this might be one of the real trees for the replacement of the canopy within our private areas. But as an amenity, open space, public tree, it's not a good idea because of its susceptibility to bark harvesting. We've seen time and time again, and we've put a lot of work into this at the Ardean Gardens. And once again, our chairperson, Mr. Francois Kricher, he's worked with Sand Parks to get them to change their strategy from painting the harvested part of the tree to painting the bark. And together with the Friends of Newlands Forest, and to a certain extent, if you drive around Cape Town and you see a painted tree, it's more than likely been at the hand of Francois Kricher at his own cost, because all the way from Takai to Constantia, all of those campers were painted by him. And in the Ardean Gardens, it's been proven that we had unpainted camphors and they got bark harvested even inside the Ardean with security 24 hours a day. So we've actually also had to paint our Araucarias, our Norfolk pines, because they're getting bark harvested too. So it's an unfortunate way to do it. We can do it, which brings us to the yellowwoods. We need to consider, folks, that Afrocarpus falcatus used to be called Podocarpus falcatus. The Outeniqua related is from Outeniqua. It's not from Cape Town, and it has proven to be extremely invasive in Cape Town. It's also very problematic because it produces a lot of fruit, which is eaten by bats who love to paint white buildings in a Jackson Pollock manner. So in horticulture, and this is where it's been proven that we haven't done really anything effective in the last 40 years. Unfortunately, thankfully, Richard Jameson, bless his cotton socks, is not here to shout at me because of this, because he made a massive contribution in the last 40 years. But on a whole, I think across South Africa, we've been fixated on indigenous, and we haven't really been looking into amenity. And there's not many trees that can survive out of the moist, nutrient-rich cliffs, protected cliffs of the Cape. That will grow even below the train line in places like Kenilworth, Claremont, Harfield Village. This is why Ace and Agunda has been, and Mikado have been proven to be so prevalent within the neighborhoods. Afrocarpus falcatus, unfortunately, in highly stressed trees in George and 2 in Radcliffe Park have become reproductive, which is a concern. So, yeah, it's something that I'm very concerned about. I've got some phenomenal trees in Ardean Gardens that we're looking after. They're highly stressed. And remember, trees take up to 8 years to really show the symptoms of stress, from things like the drought, which we're only starting to see now, and then also the optical fiber installation. So yeah, we've got one stressed tree at the Ardennes and 3 healthy ones. The 3 healthy ones are the females, which are undesirable because of their fruit, and the one that's stressed is the male. I think that's more got to do with the construction nearby than the fact that it's a male. But with things like ginkgo and ginkgo biloba, the maidenhair tree, and the Afrocarpus falcatus, only males should be planted. It's because they don't produce the fruit and the problems with the bats. So what we're seeing, because there's so many females, we're seeing this fixation on indigenous. And secondly, this lazy horticulture where nurseries have just been, and people have been growing this tree, which has now become actually as invasive as box elder.
Wow. Paul, and your depth of knowledge, your passion, and your willingness to share with everybody and to spread the knowledge is commendable. And thank you so very much for taking the time to talk to us. Thank you to Kenny and Jenny and Gabby for your comments and appreciation of the talk. Thank you to everybody for joining us. Paul, once again, thank you so very much. Belinda and everybody behind the scenes. I wish you well for the rest of the week. Keep warm if you're in Cape Town, and practice charcoal drying.
Yep.
Thanks, Paul.
Cheers, folks. Have a great day. Thank you.